Welcome everyone back to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. If you're here for the first time, let me just remind you that we are Britain's largest pro-marriage organisation, representing individuals and groups who support one man, one woman marriage. And that's not to say that other things don't take place in a liberal democracy. For sure they do, but we think one man, one woman marriage is unique, special, needs to be recognised and celebrated as such, not just for those involved and for the benefits it brings them, but for the huge benefits it brings wider society above and beyond every other relationship type. Now, can I just say, before we move into today's guest, another advertisement. We are available and taking meetings in local organisations as of now, since all the COVID restrictions have been removed. If you'd like us to come to your organisation or your church or whatever, please get in touch. You'll see the email address admin@c4m.org.uk. We're usually free to attend. So please just get in touch and let's sort something out. Now, today's guest is following a guidance leaflet that C4M recently released, which covered the Department for Education's recent guidance to schools about impartiality in teaching political type subjects, of which, of course, marriage and sexuality definitely falls into that category. It's a privilege to welcome on the channel today John Denning. John, I think your title is Head of Education at Christian Institute?
Well, my title is Education Officer, but yes, we talk about having an education department now because there's two of us. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, it's a privilege to have you today, and we're coming to talk about something which the Coalition for Marriage published recently, which was a note on recent guidance released by the Department for Education. And I wanted to talk that through, recognising that some people would much rather listen to a conversation than read through a document. And also these documents can be a bit wordy sometimes by their very nature. So I wanted to talk that through. But first of all, John, I wonder if you can tell us, is there a problem in education that supporters of real marriage might be concerned with?
Yeah, I think certainly there is. That's not to say it's a problem in every single school in the country. But yes, I mean, we provide an advice service, I mean, for us specifically for Christians, and we're contacted by well over 200 parents, teachers, school governors every year with concerns in this general area of teaching on issues of relationships, on marriage, transgender issues, that type of thing. And sometimes they're in very difficult circumstances. There's been some really horrendous situations I've dealt with where pupils who believe in traditional marriage have been really put on the spot to give their views, forced to give their view in front of the class, and that's led to really quite horrible bullying of them. Now, that doesn't always happen. There are other situations where very brave young people stand up and actually they're respected for the stand that they take. But there's certainly a problem where there are schools who think the right thing to do is to promote one side of the argument on things like marriage, on things like transgender ideology.
And things have changed fairly radically over the last, 10 years, would you say?
Yes, that's definitely true. So I think actually when same-sex marriage, the provisions for same-sex marriage came into law, that was obviously a big change in the law and in our culture. But then I think that on the back of that, there was a shift in schools as well. Partly perhaps because some of those organisations that had campaigned very hard for that legislation then were looking around to see what else they could do, and trying to affect the education system was an obvious thing to try to do. So I think that was probably a factor, but it was also just there's been a cultural change, and in some schools, teachers, governors, those who set the tone and the direction have very much gone along with that. In quite an uncritical way, and perhaps not being thoughtful about what's the appropriate way of dealing with these things in a school context.
And you mentioned something at the beginning, and we have to be balanced about these things, because on the one hand, we get people who criticise us as Coalition for Marriage, saying, look, there's no problem at all. What are you making a fuss and blowing things up over nothing for? On the other hand, we get parents contacting us saying not only is marriage not taught in their child's school, but they've had transvestite men coming in dressed in scantily clad costumes. They've had all sorts of vulgar teachings about different forms of sexual intercourse taught to children that they feel are far too young to be learning about those sorts of things. And so there's kind of a spectrum of things going on, all under the guise of permissible relationships and sexual education. And I think there's a lot of confusion out there, John, about what parents can object to, what is and isn't allowed in schools, and what, if anything, we can do about it. So as I understand it, that's the nature of the advice guidance that was issued recently by the Department for Education, dealing with some of those things. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, that's right. I think this new guidance that was released by the Department for Education isn't just about that. It's about all sorts of political issues, not just about issues of relationships and sex, but relationships and sex issues around that would definitely come within political balance. I mean, some of the things you talked about there are horrendous and clearly inappropriate. I don't think necessarily you'd want to say the only reason you shouldn't have a drag queen scantily clothed in schools is because of concerns about political balance. I think there's much more fundamental arguments about appropriateness there. I mean, certainly, well, it's the case in England, still the case at the moment in Wales that there's a requirement for age appropriateness. So that there's political impartiality is not the only argument that you can make in those sorts of situations. There are other issues there too.
So let's get into it then. I mean, first of all, we're talking about political issues, and we're not talking about party political here. We're not talking about Conservative or Labour or Liberal Democrat or whatever else. What do we mean by political issues, and what makes something political as opposed to the capital of India, which is not a political necessarily concern?
Well, it's really about where there are different viewpoints, and particularly where there are different viewpoints that have some relevance for public policy. So if you think about what is discussed in Parliament, it's not just issues of economic policy or foreign policy. It is also issues of social policy. So there are views on those sorts of things, on social policy. Those are political views. And what the guidance says quite helpfully, really, is that even where there are ethical debates and topics on which there is now some consensus amongst political parties, they can still be a subject of debate in wider society. And where there is that continued debate and different legitimate views are expressed, that's still a political issue, and schools have a duty to approach that in a fair, unbiased, balanced way.
And teaching around sexuality and gender, etc., certainly falls within that category. So what's the difference between guidance, which has been released very recently by the Department for Education in England, might add, and we'll come on to that in a moment. What's the difference between guidance and the Education Act, which has been enforced for a while?
Yes, so schools' duty is are set down in law. So in this case, it's section 406 and 407 of the 1996 Education Act. So that's obviously been around a while. In fact, it's been around even longer. It was before that. It was part of the 1986 Education Act. So there's nothing new in one sense. These are long-standing requirements in schools. But what the government has done is recognise there's a problem here. This may be in the law, but the schools aren't very well aware of it. There are problems in schools where they're not being balanced in their teaching, politically balanced. not being unbiased. And so they've released this quite detailed guidance, really. It goes on for pages and pages and pages, explaining exactly what a political issue is, how to be balanced, how to be unbiased, etc. So it's really just new guidance explaining long-standing law, but it's a helpful refresher.
But that means it only applies to England. So what about Wales, for example?
Well, Section 406 and 407 of the 1996 Education Act do apply in Wales. Don't apply in Scotland, but they do apply in Wales. So the law is actually the same for maintained schools in England and Wales, even though the guidance has been produced by the Department for Education in England. So the guidance is specific to England, but it's explaining law that applies in both England and Wales. Wales, in fact, has its own guidance on this that was released a little over a year ago now, I think it was, also that looks at teaching of citizenship and considers political balance in that context.
Okay, and is it similar guidance?
Yes, it's similar. As I say, it's specifically looking at the teaching of citizenship, whereas the guidance in England is much broader in explicitly saying this applies to every subject in the curriculum, to all the work of the school, which is true, and that's true in Wales as well. But the Wales guidance is a little bit more narrowly focused, but says some similar things.
So it's a good reminder to schools that they must be balanced in their teaching of political issues, in their presentation of political issues. Is there anything more specific that Section 406 and 407 say, the difference between the two sections maybe?
Yeah, so 406 is headed political indoctrination, and says local authority governing body head teacher shall forbid the pursuit of partisan political activities by registered pupils, and to forbid the promotion of partisan political views. So Section 406 is really about not involving younger pupils, those under the age of 12, in partisan activities, and not promoting particular political views. Section 407 is more about balance. So 406, don't promote a particular view. Section 407, well, when you do teach about these issues, and there's no restriction on schools teaching about the full range of issues and views, the guidance makes that very clear. But when you do, you must do so in a way where pupils are offered a balanced presentation of opposing views. So that's about balance.
Okay. So John, you mentioned maintained schools. What does that mean, a maintained school?
So a maintained school means any school that's run by a local authority.
Right.
So in Wales, that would mean actually every state school is a maintained school. In England, the majority of state-funded schools are not maintained schools. The majority now are academies. So technically, Section 406 and 407 don't apply to them. However, there's almost identical laws in the independent school standards in England, which means every school in England, both maintained and academies and fee-paying schools, all of them are under the same requirements, essentially, even though technically they're found in different bits of legislation. Whereas in Wales, it's just state-funded schools that this would apply to.
Okay, and it's interesting that on the day of recording, in fact, we've might have read in the news this morning about a private school in London marked down by Ofsted, not necessarily for not having balance, but spending too much time talking about political issues as opposed to educational issues. That was quite interesting.
Yes, and it was good to see Ofsted doing that, because Ofsted sometimes appears to have been used to push in the opposite direction, really, to be honest. But there's definitely an issue there where schools get into the mindset that education almost is activism, and that learning is activism. Well, that's not right, is it? I mean, learning should be about learning, and it should, as this requires, be impartial rather than just trying to get pupils involved in activism.
So let's try and help some parents that might be listening, John, and if they're thinking, well, there's stuff going on in school that I've picked up on that I'm not sure I'm happy about, I'm not sure if I'm able to complain about, and how do I work my way through this kind of rat's nest of problems that are bothering me as a parent and my child. How do we look at the issue of of balance as a parent, and thinking of resources that might be used. Somebody comes home and says, well, we watched this video today which was all about that subject and nothing else, or we read that book, and there seems to be, how does a parent know to think balance is not there, or this has reached a point where I need to say something?
I think it's very important that parents do say something, and schools will, any decent school will welcome that, because I used to be a teacher, and as a teacher, the children who do best in education are the ones who are not just sitting passively in there, seeing education as something done to them. It's the pupils who are wanting to learn, who are actively engaged in their education. And often you discover at parents' evenings that's because the parents also are actively engaged and actively concerned about education. So schools should welcome parents who want to be involved, who want to talk, who want to discuss what's going on, and who have concerns. In fact, the guidance on political impartiality instructs schools it is important that all schools treat concerns about impartiality from parents, carers, or others seriously. Schools should take steps where necessary and proportionate to rectify any breaches of these legal duties on impartiality that are brought to their attention. So parents shouldn't feel fearful of raising these issues. And there's no need to go in sort of all guns blazing. It's best to start in quite a low-key way and just have a conversation with a form tutor, with a class teacher, whoever is most appropriate in the first instance, and express concern. So it's best to go in with a really clear idea of what the issues are. So it is best, as far as you can, to find out from your child what has been said, what hasn't been said. There's not necessarily a problem with under these political impartiality guidelines with schools showing a video that promotes a particular view, but then they must also present the other side of the argument. And that's the thing to focus on. I mean, I have to admit, when I was a teacher, I didn't spend a lot of time reading government guidance. I might, as a teacher, not even have known this guidance had come out. It's not something that teachers are often paying attention to. That they're planning their lessons, they're marking their books, they're doing all the stuff that teachers have to do. And so it may well be up to parents, in fact, to draw this guidance to the attention of schools. And because if schools don't know about it, they're not going to follow it. So parents do have an important role, I think, in doing that. But if a parent feels they're not getting anywhere, then all schools have to have a complaints process. It's usually published on the school's website, not just ask, and the school has to give you a copy of their policy, and you can follow that through. And schools have to show that they have handled complaints properly. They have to show that they have answered points adequately. And if they haven't, then at a state-funded school, you can escalate that further. In England, to the Department for Education. In Wales, it would be to the local authority. But you can go further if those initial conversations don't yield anything.
And that's excellent advice, John. As you'll know, I think that the challenges here for parents are kind of threefold. Firstly is, do we know what our kids are being taught on a day-to-day basis? I mean, we might know if we're helping them with a specific bit of physics homework or something else like that. But in terms of the sorts of lessons these things come up in, they might not be discussed regularly as homework issues at home or something. It's very hard for parents just to, first of all, become aware of what's going on. All they'll pick up on is perhaps, after several years, my child seems to be thinking very differently to me these days. What's gone wrong? And how do you almost like circumvent that process? It's almost like parenting advice, but it's to do with teaching. How do you get in there and find out in a non-confrontational, helpful, concerned, but not overly dominant manner what's going on a day-to-day basis?
It's a difficult balance, isn't it? I think that your most important source of information has to be your child. there are questions you can ask of schools and copies of various policies you can look at, but it is your own child has to be your first port of call, really, your most important source of information. And I think that's about keeping open conversations with your children, so they feel that there is that openness to talking about things, but without, I think, every single day when your child gets home from school saying, well, what did they teach you today? And did they say anything about same-sex marriage? And did they say anything about transgenderism? I don't think that's going to be helpful to have that sort of level of interrogation. But keeping that communication open, and recognizing, given where our culture is, however effective parents are at raising these things, our children are surrounded not just by the actual teaching coming from teachers, but just amongst their peer group, with a culture that has changed really quite significantly since we were at school. And if we are feeling as parents there are things about that cultural shift that we think are wrong and are unhelpful, then as parents we need to be talking to our children about that, because they're not necessarily going to hear that perspective anywhere else. And parents are children's primary educators. And
that's the key point, isn't it? Even though in Wales, for example, you're not allowed to exclude your child anymore from certain teaching in the way that you were before, parents still are recognised as the child's primary educator. What's happening in society around us and the culture around us, there is an onus on parents to perhaps put a bit more effort, because you can't always rely that it's not being taught, or that things aren't being taught that you might want them to be taught in the way you might want them to be taught. So you've got to get involved. So John, just thinking about what else parents can do. I mean, maybe there's a need for more parents to feel they can get involved at governor level, at parent-teacher association level, just to be more involved. We often say decisions are made by the people that are in the room. So if you feel up to it, get some friends, get involved, and try and be involved in influencing decisions. I just wonder, have you got any examples where that's actually shown to be a productive thing to do?
Yes, yes, definitely. I've spoken to people who've done that, who've got involved as parent governors. And in Scotland, you don't have governing bodies, of course, in state schools, but there you have the Parents' Council. And so, yes, I mean, I know of a situation where two parents did stand up and make their voice heard. They were, I suppose, quite nervous about doing so. But the moment they did so, they found everybody else agreed with them, but had been too scared to say anything. So often it does take that bit of courage to say something, and then suddenly you find you have a whole load of allies that you didn't realize you had, but it needs that first person to open their mouth and say something.
Great. Well, that's a huge encouragement to us all then. And one other thing maybe we can touch on, John, which you don't want to come across as unfeeling or unconcerned with difficulties that people may be experiencing around their own sexuality as they perceive it. And you don't want to come across as uncaring and brutal and hard and saying, none of that, thank you very much. Where's the balance in approaching these things with gentleness and care, but also sense and reasonableness, and saying, well, so far and far enough?
With any balance, it takes some real thinking about the situation, and schools should be thoughtful about that situation in terms of the children that they are educating, the issues they're facing in their own lives or in their families. There is that need for sensitivity in how things are addressed, but sensitivity never requires a school to promote a particular viewpoint. You don't need to promote a viewpoint in order to be supportive and encouraging and helpful.
And that of course, is because young children have very malleable minds and are easily programmed.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, that's right. And that means that teachers are in a very, very responsible position, because they do have a huge influence on the way that children and young people are developing in their thinking. And it's important that's another reason why the duty of impartiality is so important, that teachers aren't using their position as a platform for promoting their own views to children at an impressionable age, where they will be taken along with what actually is just the teacher's own personal views with which other people will disagree.
The other thing I think, which was very, very good that you pointed out, is that teachers might not necessarily know what they can and can't teach, and are often stuck in a place where they feel obliged to teach things that they might not even feel comfortable with themselves, but think it's something they must do. So gently having a word with teachers and saying, have you seen this guidance, by the way? It might help you in what you're doing, because we're concerned about things, maybe you are too. That might be a really helpful prompt for teachers. I thought that was an excellent point you made.
That's really important. I mean, there is a duty in England to consult parents, for every school to consult parents on its relationships and sex education policy. And I've talked to teachers who are just despairing that parents aren't speaking up. And as a result of parents not speaking up, the school ends up with a policy which then requires the teacher to adopt an approach that they're deeply unhappy with. But of course, they have a duty to their employer and their job is on the line, whereas parents are in a much stronger position actually than a teacher to raise concerns and objections, and well, not just objections, but positive suggestions as well about how schools can approach things in a balanced and respectful way.
That's really good. And there have been one or two examples, have there not, John, of external organisations coming in and telling schools and teachers that things are legal requirements when in fact they're not legal requirements. Things around the Equalities Act, for example. Yeah.
So the Equality Act, there's a lot said about it. It's made to bear a lot of weight, I think, by organisations that were, coming from a place where they really wanted the Equality Act to come into force, delighted when it came into force, but then have tended to read more into it than is really there. I mean, the Equality Act primarily is about protecting people from discrimination. It's not about what is taught. In fact, the Equality Act explicitly says, well, the chapter on schools in the Equality Act explicitly says nothing in this chapter applies to the content of the curriculum. You don't decide what you teach by balancing people's rights. You decide what you teach by the fruits of academic study. You want to be sensitive, obviously, and considerate in the way you do so, the way you go about teaching issues, but your decisions on what is true and what's false don't rest on balancing people's rights.
So it's more about making sure there's a ramp into the classroom rather than what the content of the curriculum is.
Yes, exactly.
The emphasis is different.
Yeah, that's right.
And what about things like age appropriateness? I mean, who decides what age appropriateness is? And especially at younger ages, where a year can make whether you're born in September or August, can make a very, very big difference to your age appropriateness. Who decides that and how does that work?
When it comes to issues like that, there has to be professional judgment. There has to be a judgment that's exercised. You cannot write down in law, here is a detailed explanation of what is age appropriate, and it's going to vary from child to child. But of course, it's parents who know their child best. It's parents who are the best judges of what is age appropriateness, because they know their child, and what might be appropriate for one child may not be appropriate for another child of the same age. So I do think if a parent feels that the teaching of a school is not age appropriate for their child, they should be drawing that to the attention of the school and to the attention of teachers, because it is a requirement. Now, the law doesn't say it's parents' views of age appropriateness that counts, but common sense would tell you, if you're trying to make that judgment on age appropriateness, you should be having regard to what parents think on that issue. In Wales, as you already referred to, the law will be changing on this. And in Wales, the requirement is going to be that teaching on relationships and sexuality education, so it's going to be called in Wales, has to be developmentally appropriate. So that does take some account of the idea that children of the same age may be at different developmental stages. So there's still that requirement there. But it has to be a conversation between parents and the school about what is age appropriate or what is developmentally appropriate for their child. And I think if parents are sensible and constructive in the way they engage with schools on that, then I would hope that most schools and most teachers would take that seriously. But it's not going to happen without parents having the conversation and taking that
absolutely.
initiative.
Yeah, and they've got, and I just can't emphasize that point you made, another excellent point, which is that parents are so much more powerful than teachers, and the teachers in many cases are just sat there waiting for the parents to say something so they can then justify saying, well, look, we've had this feedback from parents.
Yeah.
And so, you know, a real encouragement for people to do that. In terms of just one or two other aspects of the cover note that we produced on the guidance, and of course there's a link to that down in the description, but it refers to objectivity around things like social media in schools. So does that affect, there seems to be rainbow flags on everyone's social media profiles these days. Does that mean schools shouldn't be doing that sort of thing?
I think that's very questionable. Yes, I think a school's resources, especially a state school, are being paid by the taxpayer. And it's not for the school to be supporting, using those resources just to support one particular cause with which taxpayers in general may not all agree, let alone the parents at the school. That's not what the school receives its government funding for, and that's not what it should be doing. So yes, I think it's very questionable for schools to use their social media, the school's social media, to promote a political cause. And yes, the guidance does say that.
And then, I mean, we've covered most of the ground I wanted to cover with you, John. It's very good. But I suppose if parents get to a position where they think, well, I'm just not being heard, or I still don't like what's happening in my school, they've written to the local authority in Wales, or they've got hold of the Department of Education in England, and they've had short shrift. What next?
I suppose that the next step would be some kind of legal action. You do have to, I think, have followed through that whole complaints process in its entirety. First, that's important, and that's important to get that right. You know, you might, I should say, I'm not a lawyer, but you might struggle to then, if you haven't raised an issue in a complaint, and then you try to go to a court, the court might say, well, you know, why didn't you raise this within the complaint system? So the complaints system is important. But yes, I mean, if you completely exhausted that, and then you went to the Department for Education in England or local authority in Wales, and then they still didn't uphold your complaint, then I suppose legal action would be the next step. But if you can make a really clear case, particularly if you can approach the Department for Education and say, well, look, I've gone through this complaint system at the school keeps saying this, but here is what the Department for Education guidance says, here's what the school has done, and actually the school hasn't really addressed this point in response to my complaint. The Department for Education is going to struggle, I think, to not uphold your complaint if the facts are clear and it's a clear breach of what the Department for Education itself has said. And I think actually if they were to not uphold the complaint in those circumstances, then exposing that in the media might be a helpful thing to do, and that might force the Department for Education to stick by its own guidance if it's not.
And of course, people of a Christian faith could get hold of yourselves or others for advice and guidance in those areas.
Yes, that's right. Yeah,
as well, which is a wonderful resource and a privilege to have. And so, just finally, maybe, and some thoughts around not just parents but teachers as well. Maybe if you're able to give any help. Question we get asked regularly. There's a rainbow day in school, as you might call it, or something else like that, which is, you know, a very active school embracing celebration of gay pride and lots of other things. And some parents just think, well, I don't want to celebrate that, if that's okay. And some teachers might think, I don't want to celebrate that. What can you do? What can you say?
Well, it's important, yes, to recognise that there can be no compulsion on teachers to celebrate it and to show their support. But yes, for a teacher, this requirement for political balance in all your teaching and in all that you're doing in the school is very, very helpful, because it protects you as a teacher from being compelled to promote a view with which you disagree, because actually you shouldn't be promoting any viewpoint of that sort. So it can be a very helpful thing for teachers to raise their concerns, both for themselves and in terms of what parents and pupils may feel about it. Particularly these celebration days, which actually require children to show by their external appearance, by what they're wearing, whether or not they support a particular cause. That's wrong for so many reasons, but it does then end up marginalising some children and potentially exposing them to bullying, and that's really not inclusive, is it? So I think there are good arguments that the teacher can make and to express their concerns, both in terms of themselves and in terms of the impact on the children they teach, and in terms of what parents will feel about it. And yes, stand up against it.
And I think that's another interesting point in the case that was in the news this morning, where Ofsted said that some children didn't feel safe expressing views that were not necessarily in agreement with the teacher's views, or the prevailing views, if you like. And school has got to be a safe place where all views can be expressed and explored and dealt with reasonably.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's so important, that the school is there and is welcoming of all peoples from all backgrounds and of all different beliefs, and makes them feel included in school, and that their views are welcome, and creates that atmosphere where there can be open discussion, and we can learn from one another, and that makes for that prepares children actually for life in modern Britain, where they're going to face a whole load of views and a whole load of people with a whole massive range of views, and they need, in the interests of a cohesive society, we need to be able to have these discussions.
That's right. School becomes a place where you learn how to think, not what to think. Absolutely correct. Okay, well, John Denning, can I thank you for all the work that you are doing? Invitation to anybody, of course, who has got more issues. If you're of Christian faith, then you're more than welcome to contact John, and we'll put his contact details in the description below. Reminder, of course, that we are an organisation that represents people of all faiths and none, but nevertheless, let me thank you, John, for all that you are doing, all you have done, and more power to your arm going forward. John Denning, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony.